Welcome to day 5 of the guided application program, guys. Thank you all for being here. As I mentioned to you all in the Slack channel today, we do have a special guest. We have Guillermo, who is the leader of pre-work and the man himself who will be performing the live technical assessment here for y'all. Guillermo, go ahead and interview or introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Guillermo. I graduated in January of 2022. So I'm an alum just like you guys. And some of us came back to continue to work with Code Platoon because we believe in the mission, helping veterans and teaching you a skill that even today is very sought after. So I'll just go over a couple things about the application just because I've done this for a while now, and just go over some tips and tricks and just kind of things to avoid that happen all the time. So when you fill out the application, probably one of the most common mistakes is people will do their video and not cover all the questions. Make sure to cover all the questions in the video and the prompt. Um, and another common mistake is you won't set your video to unlisted. You'll keep it private. So then I'll have to email you, be like, hey, can you set it to just unlisted? Don't make it private, because if you make it private, I can't see it when I click on your link. So that's a pretty common mistake. The coding challenge is get as many points as you can. The video, pretty straightforward, just follow the prompt. The questions, just answer the questions to the best of your ability. Everyone's situation is slightly different, and I always enjoy um, reading your questions and finding out who you were. Because believe it or not, you become a use case for people that come after you. I'll be like, oh, this one guy, he was actually one of the most famous stories. I'm not going to dive this guy out, but he was a dishwasher at Olive Garden, and the reason why I remember that one is because I used to work at Olive Garden. I was a bar back and a busser, so when I read his story, it hit close to home. Anyway, he's a dev now. He's doing great. So definitely do that. One thing that I have realized though with the rise of ChatGPT is people will just punch in those questions to ChatGPT. Don't do that. We're not evaluating your life story, right? We're just reading them, make sure that you know why you're here. That's it. But avoid doing that because then you get really cookie cutter responses on your application. That's pretty much it. Make sure that you submit your application and do your assessment before January 3rd, midnight. And at this point, it'll be like 10 p.m. because the last two slots there were already taken. You cannot take your technical assessment until after you complete your application. We need to evaluate your application, then I'll add you to the pre-work Slack channel. In the pre-work Slack channel, there's a Calendly link, and you can schedule your live technical using the Calendly link. Yeah, that's pretty much the entire spiel that I have. I'll take any questions you have about the assessment now.
Crickets. I know you guys have questions.
I know they do too, because I get emails and DMs
I
all the
know.
time.
Yeah,
Can
right.
can you walk us through an example of one, I guess,
Can I walk you through an example
of like a
a
live assessment, how it goes from like start to finish for a
I can give you a rough idea. It's pretty straightforward. I'll go ahead and give you the spiel that I'm going to give you right from the beginning. So this is what happens on my end, and I'll try to give you a broader overview. I can't walk you through the assessment, like step by step, but I can give you a pretty good idea, right? So what happens is when you finish your application, I send you the acceptance and then I add you to the pre-work channel and then you schedule your assessment. On my end, I get an email saying, hey, this person scheduled their assessment. And right before your assessment, I actually reread your application because I want to know who this person is because I read so many, right? So everyone's story starts to kind of blend together. So I always read your application. So when you meet me on your assessment, I just read your application. So keep that in mind, right? So typically I'll ask you something about your application, just to let you know that, hey, I read your application through and through. I watched your video. I know who you are. I know what your story is. And then I'll say something like this. Um, this is your live technical assessment. I just have to go over a couple things before we get started. And you'll be like something like, yes. And I'll be like, Code Platoon does these technical assessments for two reasons. The first reason is just to make sure that you have a baseline understanding of programming fundamentals. And the second reason is we need to vet everyone that comes to Code Platoon, make sure you didn't cheat on your application and you can kind of somewhat know how to code. Does that make sense? And then you'll say something like, yes, that makes sense. And then I'll ask you to share your screen. You can use whatever text editor you would like. I always recommend Replit, but if you're already comfortable with VS Code or you want to use anything else, I had someone use like Pie Spider the other day. I've never seen that before. Dude, that's cool too. Like whatever, as long as you know how to use it. Probably the most common mistake on the technical assessment is people don't know how to use their text editor. I don't know why that's the number one issue that I have at those assessments, but it's always been like that. They'll pick a text editor that they don't know how to use. Like they'll start using VS Code and then they don't know how to use it, so they'll switch like middle of the assessment to Replit or something, which is totally fine. But it kind of like messes people's flow. So don't do that. Make sure whatever text editor you use. Then I'll Slack you. We use Slack a lot. I'll Slack you a coding challenge. You'll copy and paste it. You'll go over it. You'll either go over it as you're writing out the code, or you'll pseudocode it and then you'll write it. To me, it doesn't matter as long as you know what you're writing and why it works or why it doesn't. Then I'll ask you questions about the technical assessment. Typically, I give 3 challenges. Sometimes people only get 2. If you run through them really quickly, there's no reason for me to waste anyone's time and give you 3. And what we test are the following. We test loops, variable assignment and reassignment, string and array manipulation, and key value pairs and dictionaries. We test those 4 things. Why do we test those 4 things? You can do everything in programming with those 4 things. There's nothing in programming you can't do without them, right? I always get questions about like high order methods and stuff. And if you've heard me talk before, you know what I'm about to say. Everything in programming is just an iteration. It's just a loop. So all those built-in methods, there's just a loop under the hood, like map, filter, if you're familiar with JavaScript already. Max for Python, it's just a linear search and it's finding the largest integer and then holding on to it. It's all done in one step, one nice little like built-in function, but it's just a linear search. It's just a normal loop. Like if you did for I in range, it'd be literally the exact same thing, except slightly more code because you have to, save the value or whatever the case may be. So that's pretty much how it goes. It's pretty straightforward. Oh, super important thing about the live technical assessment. I wouldn't be worried too much about it. We don't test what you know, and this is probably the most important thing that I have to say about the technical assessment. We don't test what you know. We test that you have the minimum level of understanding to come to our program. We have great instructors, we have great curriculum. We're going to coach you up. You just have to come in with a minimal baseline understanding, right? The minute that I understand in the live assessment that you have the minimum required, the interview is over. If that's 1 challenge, if that's 2 challenges, if that takes 3 challenges, fine. But the minute that I have that understanding that 1, you didn't cheat, and 2, you have a minimum level of understanding of these programming fundamentals, you're good to go. That's it.
We had a question in the chat for you, Guillermo. Is it Python coding specific or a general tech out? I'm assuming they're referring to can they use JavaScript or
Yeah, you
other
can.
languages?
You can use JavaScript or Python. It doesn't matter to me. It's the same. You use both languages interchangeably. And typically, when you land at your first job, a lot of the times you won't get to work on necessarily the language that you're the strongest or the language that you know. Typically, beggars can't be choosers. So for your first job, you pretty much take anything. If they're coding in Ruby, you're going to code in Ruby. If they're coding in Java, you're going to code in Java, and that's just the way it is.
I have a question for you, Guillermo, for the students. What typically is the reason why somebody might not pass their technical assessment that you've come to see?
They use ChatGPT for everything. That's probably the most common. The two most common one is, 1, they don't know how to use their text editor. That's always been ever since I got here almost 3 years ago. That was like the most common one. I don't know why. But then shortly after the rise of the popularity of ChatGPT, because I think ChatGPT was out for like a handful of months before really the majority of the people caught on. I think it was just out and it was just very niche use. But now it's rampant, right? Now you have people like at work, you have companies blocking ChatGPT because people are putting like proprietary code inside ChatGPT. And I don't know if you've read the disclaimer on ChatGPT, but the minute that you put code in there or anything in there, it's property of them. It's on their servers. And don't think they're not using it to train other models. So anyway, so yeah, that's probably the most common one. When they've used, the rise of AI has been really, really great, but it's been it's been kind of detrimental for people learning how to code if you use it as a crutch. And that's kind of what we've seen, not only in this boot camp, but I think in pretty much, and I wouldn't even limit it to a boot camp, to pretty much, like imagine being a high school teacher right now and trying to grade an essay. That's impossible. That's impossible. I don't know what they're doing. Same thing is happening in our learning environment. I told you, I made the reference earlier. People are even like the questions. I made a joke to my girlfriend the other day. Like the questions that we ask you in your application, people are putting that into ChatGPT. I'm like, what? I'm asking you about your life. Dude, just do like 5 sentences about what your life or why you want to come to Code Platoon. Like you're not being graded. It's not for a grade. I'm the only guy that reads it. You know what I mean?
How hard was your life? Oh no, ChatGPT, tell me.
Yeah, that's tough, man. Don't do that. Because I'm sure everyone here has heard fake it till you make it. That isn't going to work in tech. In programming, that's just not going to work. I was a computer engineer dropout before I switched to software. And engineering is actually pretty easy because you remember like a dozen formulas and you plug and chug everything. Right? Now you don't even have to do it by hand. You just put it into a program and it works. Right? That's easy. What makes software engineering incredibly difficult is so big. It's intractable, and there's like a million variables. Like you have and you guys probably already figured this out. You have a semicolon out of place, it crashes your entire program. You can't figure out why. Well, imagine having thousands of files and like thousands of semicolons, right? Or when one misspelling can crash the entire thing, right? So in that kind of environment, you're not going to be able to fake it, right? You either know what you're doing or you don't. It's very hard in that way. So don't overly rely on ChatGPT to answer your question, Roger.
I have a question from Jamar Knight. What were the things that you were checking for again? For the
Yeah,
what you're looking for?
yeah, I'll go ahead and post it in the guided application channel. If you don't catch it here, I'll go ahead and post it anyway. So loops, you got to know how to do your loops. Variable assignment and reassignment, string and array manipulation, and then key value pairs and dictionaries. Those 4 things. But I'll post it in the Slack channel. Stephen Dubs, it was at the level of script kiddie. Is that about the level you're looking for? I'm not quite sure what that question is.
I've never heard of script kiddie either.
Can you clarify, Stephen? I'm not quite sure what that is.
I think a script kiddie refers to somebody who can like run code, get code to run, but not really understand what it's doing. They just know how to like copy and paste code.
Okay, it needs to be more than that. You need to know what you're writing. You need to know what you're writing. And I don't want to scare anyone here, right? So take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. When you get to your job, writing code is the easy part. It's all the integration stuff that you're actually going to do as a dev that's really, really hard, right? ChatGPT can write code. That's not why they're going to pay you a lot of money, right? They're going to pay you a lot of money to think out problems and figure out why the Oracle database isn't working with your internal software that someone built 12 years ago, right? And making them work and play nice together. Those are the problems you're going to be solving when you get to your job, right? You're not going to be like, oh, you need to write this. That's the easy stuff. So you got to be really able to understand the code because that's the easiest part of your job. They're going to hand you this code base. They're going to be like, hey, look through it, step through it, figure out how it works. Okay, so now that you understand it, we're having this issue. We need you to fix it, or we need you to integrate it with this, or hey, this application is going to be deprecated. That functionality needs to be added to this application, right? That's what you're going to do at work, right? If you haven't heard that before, well, now you have, I guess. Those are the kind of problems that you solve when you get a dev job.
Here's a question that I want to ask the students as well. How big does reading comprehension and problem solving skills play a part into this live technical assessment?
Uh, Not that big of a role simply because we're just checking if you kind of understand code and how it works. Right. Eventually it'll become pretty much all you do at work. But right now, you're in the infancy stage of learning how to code. So we're just checking your syntax. We're checking, hey, can you do simple things with code? Can you do simple things with code? The big problem solving portion won't come later. It won't come until really the immersive, right? Lim Yu, sorry if I mispronounced your name. You're saying, can we finish the application for Feb 2? I would try to finish it by at the very latest, like January 1st, and then take your assessment the second or the third. That would be the latest. Ideally, I would try to finish it this weekend. Ideally, but I know, the holidays, people have important stuff, but you can take that for what it's worth. You always want to be early, just in case something's wrong with your application, like your YouTube video isn't set to unlisted, or you didn't complete enough points for your coding challenges, or you didn't answer the questions or something. I do get incomplete applications quite a bit that I have to kick back. As long as you complete it, you're good to go. But sometimes I do get incomplete applications. We get, not me. Try to solve as much as you can. That being said, I would try to get as many points as possible because that's just going to be good training for the assessment. So that's the advice we give.
I had received a question, Guillermo, I believe like a day ago or 2 days ago, about what happens if someone schedules a technical assessment, let's say for tomorrow. They take it and they fail. Are they able to retake the technical assessment again before the deadline?
Yeah, great question. So Platoon has a one retake policy. If you don't pass your assessment, let's say you schedule it for Monday and you don't pass it, you still have until the third to retake it. You do get one retake if you want to take advantage of it. Some people feel weird about it. Some people want to see where they're at. Some people, they just need more time before they can take a shot at it. Some people haven't finished the application. So everyone's use case is a little different, but yes, you have a one retake policy. And Platoon has a standing policy of, we don't really deny anyone, but we just won't accept you until you're ready. So there's been people that have, I'm not going to name any names, but there's people that have failed his assessment 5, 6, 7 times. Got pushed a couple cohorts, eventually came to code return and graduated successfully. That has happened. It doesn't happen very frequently, but it has happened. No, there isn't any other ones, Marianne. I think you're good to go. Any other questions, guys?
Awesome. It looks like we don't have any more questions, either that or people are just too shy. But thank you very much, Guillermo, for showing up today. Do you have any closing remarks?
That's all. Best of luck, guys. See you guys in the program.
Much appreciated, Guillermo. Thank you very much. All right. Now, to get back to business, I'm gonna go ahead and send out the attendance form for today. Please do me a favor and fill it out. Take the next 30 seconds to fill it out. Hopefully today's brief with Guillermo solve any kind of concerns or anxiety that you guys might have had with the assessment. It's nothing to really be afraid of. We just want to make sure that you guys are being receptive and you're going to be successful in the cohort, right? Just like he said, it's not that you're being denied. We just want to make sure that you don't waste your time, 15 weeks, if you're not ready for this specific cohort. Um, Personally, I'm a firm believer that anybody can code. I think it's something that anybody can pick up. It's almost like picking up a second language, right? It's not something that no one cannot do because they're not smart enough. I think every single one of you guys has the ability to become a software developer. Um, it's just how much work you put in is how much work or how much you're gonna get back, right? So maybe at this moment you're not in the state to put in that much effort into your coding journey, and that's okay, right? We all come from different ways of life, and we have different responsibilities, both as service members, husbands or wives. You know, we have our own things going on in life, so it right now is not the moment for you, and you're not exactly ready. That's okay. You can always retake it at a later time and move forward with Platoon. But without further ado, I sent out the attendance form. We're gonna go ahead and move forward with today's lecture, which is gonna be Python loops. Once again, reiterating what Guillermo said, what's gonna be checked for in the the actual assessment. So today's a really important day. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And after this week, guys, you guys should all have everything that you guys need in regards to the tools to be successful in your live technical assessment. Right, the last day of actual like lecture is Friday. Come next week, those 3 days of class are putting everything that we have learned together um, into you know some what we call mini projects, which are essentially just coding challenges of how we can use everything that we have learned up to this point in a way that we can solve these problems. Um, and what I've come to see from a lot of you guys, the students, is it looks like you guys are receiving these tools, but you guys are confused of how to apply them. So if you are in that boat and you don't know how these tools will help you in your coding questions, uh, next week is a very important week because that's where we essentially it's our culminating week where we grab everything that we've learned this last couple 2 weeks and put it together to solve some questions and see how variables, loops, dictionaries, and all these different data structures come into play to reach some form of outcome. So highly recommend you guys do try to show up and participate as much as you guys can next week to ensure that you are as successful as possible in your live technical assessment. Now, we should be all looking at my VS Code. Before I move forward, I do want to demonstrate something real quick to you guys of how to essentially use code spaces for your technical assessment. All right, so we've seen code spaces to open up some kind of to clone our Git repository for our curriculum, but Roger, like, what if I want to use code spaces for my interview? Well, I'm gonna go ahead and set this up to show you guys how that can be done. I'm going to clone the repository to set up the code space as if I'm a student in this class, right? I use a blank template and it'll set up my code space. And as you guys may already know, code space is a little slow, so do give it a minute to kind of warm up. I'll just choose Dark Modern. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna clone my Git repository. I add the URL. And it hates me. There we go. Why are you not doing it? Okay. Well, I'll just clone it manually. Git clone. Allow. So if you ever encounter this issue, guys, where you're trying to clone it with the search bar at the very top after you press the button and it's not working for you, you can run the command in your terminal, git clone, and then type in the URL for the repository, And what it'll do is it will do the exact same thing. Oh, my apologies. I copy a different repository instead of the guide application. This is for foundations of programming. There you go. Git clone. There you go. Now we have guide application. All right, so right now the code space is currently configured for the guide application curriculum. We talked about installing Jupyter notebooks, right? So I'll do that here real quick. And then let's get Python in this bad boy. But it's all installed now. Let's actually run our code real quick. There we go. All right, so it's working. All right, now I am the student. I want to create somewhere where I can write my code for my technical assessment. So what I'm going to do is I can either do it in the guide application folder, or outside of there, I can just kind of click out. So I'm within this directory. I'm gonna make a new file. All right. And here I'm gonna create either a Python file or a JavaScript file, whatever you guys feel the most comfortable with, that you guys want to take your technical assessment with. You can do it here. And I'm gonna call this technical assessment dot, and here is where I'm going to specify what type of file I want to create. If you want to code in Python, then you would do dot py. All right, and this will create a Python file that allows you to run Python code. If you want to JavaScript, then you can do something very similar, because I know we have some people here that are very familiar with JavaScript, but instead of dot py, you're gonna do dot JS. And you can already see my code space can identify the difference between both of these, right? We see the Python logo here and the JavaScript logo here for the JS file, right? For the Python file, I'm going to write something very simple like print hello. And there's two ways of running your scripts on VS Code. One, which is a very simple and beginner way of doing it, which is coming here to the very top right and pressing the run button. And we see here that it runs and it prints out the output on my terminal, right? It prints the output on the terminal. Unlike Jupyter notebooks, where it prints it out directly on the notebook itself. And this is the reason why we use Jupyter notebooks. It's very user-friendly for those of you guys who are just starting off to code. For Python, the output is going to be printed out on your terminal, or essentially your console, right? We call this like our console or terminal. So this is where you'll see all these print statements. Now for JavaScript, you would do console.log, hello. And for some reason here, it's not showing me the print, right? Or the run method here. And I'll show you guys how we can get around that in a second. And I'll show you with the Python one. So on Python, I was able to press run and run it. Now, what if for some reason you just saw here, like the JavaScript one, I don't have that run method, and I already know why it doesn't have it, but I'll explain to you in a bit why. Well, in the event you don't have this run method, the way that you run the file is through your terminal, right? And you want to be in the same directory of where your file is located at. Well, to see where you are in the directory, you can use a command called pwd. And it shows you where you are in this directory. I'm currently within workspaces, and inside of workspaces, I am in a directory or folder called codespaces-blank. Now, I want to see what files are currently located within this directory or folders. And to do that, I use the command of ls, which I believe stands for list. Let's just make sure. Linux ls command, meaning, I don't know off the top of my head, list directory. All right, so it is list, but specifically, it's telling you to list out the directories that are currently within this folder. So by typing ls and printing enter, or press enter, I can see here it's going to show me everything that's within this directory, which is pretty accurate, right? I have FOP, guided application, and ignore FOP, that's something else. I have the technical assessment file I created and the technical assessment file for Pi created as well. So I am currently within the location of where these files are at. Now, to run these files within my terminal, I'm going to call for a Python file. I'm going to use Python and then the name of the file that I want to run. So I do technical-assessment.py. And when I press enter, we see here that it did the exact same thing as the play button at the very top that runs my Python file. Now, the reason I'm not getting the technical assessment.js file to run with the run method is probably because I don't have some kind of JavaScript extension on there that I can read it. But the way that you would run a JavaScript file on your terminal is instead of using Python, you're going to use what's known as Node, right? Node, and then the name of the file, .js. And you see that it works now, right? I run Node, and I can run hello, and this changes up a little bit so we can identify these. Hello, this is JavaScript. And I can run this again. And we see here that it ran the JavaScript file specifically, right? Now, the reason why it doesn't have the run button here, I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on it, it's because I don't have JavaScript installed, I think. CodeSpace is a little foreign to me, but if I install the Python, the JavaScript extension, oh no, it still hates me. Well, oh well, what if I install Node? Do I have a Node? It should just be, no. Okay, well, that didn't fix it, but at least now you know how to run a JavaScript file in your terminal, which is using the node command, and then calling the JavaScript file, and that'll run the script, right? And this works just like the Jupyter notebooks work, right? So if we did something like define a function called greeting, and then it takes in X, which will be the greeting, and I want to print out X. If I call the method greeting and say that hello is the X, when I run this, we see here that it runs my function. It ran that hello. So it still works just the same as Jupyter notebooks did, right? But here it gives you a blank canvas without all that extra mumbo jumbo. This can be specifically done for your question, right? So Guillermo might tell you something like, let's see, write a function that, loops or that prints out a greeting, right? He might give you that. It maybe gives you some text to copy on here that you can use to reference, or you can just kind of write some pseudocode after he asks you that question, so you kind of reread it over and over again. And then you come down here and you write some awesome code, right? Whatever it may be. But you guys can definitely use code spaces if you want to use this for your technical assessment. If you feel more comfortable with Replit, if you've never used Replit, it's repl.it. It'll bring you to their website. If you click start building, it's going to ask you to sign in, unfortunately, which let me get out of here so you guys don't see my login. I trust y'all, but this is going to go on YouTube. Okay. Right. If you decide to use Replit, you could do that. Maybe I'm not too familiar with Replit. I don't use it often, but I can see here recent Replits. I have some other stuff here that I've worked on. But let's go ahead and create Python right here. And oh, it's telling me to pay. Oh, no, this is garbage. Don't use this. If it's telling you to pay, don't use this. Use something else. All right. As you can see, probably CodeSpaces is a lot better. And it's probably because I see here free repls. I have 52 out of 3. Before Replit wasn't, a paid thing. It looks like nowadays it's probably, one of those like paid stuff. What if, can I delete these? I could come down here and delete some of these replets. I see 52 out of 3. If I refresh this, I see free repos 50 out of 3. So if you really want to use replet, you're gonna have to delete some of the repos that you already have that you might have used before. You can see 2 years ago. This is when I was coming in, so it's kind of funny. So you can definitely use replet, but you only have a limit of 3 repos. You have to delete everything else that you have here to ensure you use some of the free ones that you have access to. And I saw a message on the chat pop up. Can you set an env variable to run any Python file without to enter Python in front of the file? Stephen, yes, but that is out of scope, and I'm not about to confuse the entire class with this. But you can do configuration, especially if you have your VS Code. Marianne, I see you paid. They got you. What can I say? It sucks to suck. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, you do not want to pay, guys. Nothing in Platoon. We're not gonna make you pay for anything, right? Nothing that you do needs money, right? There's gonna come a point. The only time that you might have to pay out of pocket for something, and you'll encounter this later, will be for the certification exam for your cloud practitioner cert. You will have to pay it initially, but that's going to get reimbursed to you right afterwards, right? So essentially, you're not going to pay for anything. You won't spend any money. It will get reimbursed for you. So you don't have to lose money, if that makes sense, right? Sorry, Marianne, I don't know what to tell you. I'll specify to marketing and maybe the pre-work as well to let you guys know not to pay for stuff like that. You do not have to pay for anything. Absolutely not. That is not acceptable. Do not pay for anything, guys, at all. All the stuff that we show you guys here is free, and you can do the exact same thing. If you have some kind of membership, Marianne, I would stop that immediately. But all right, let's go ahead and actually move forward with today's class because today's actually very important. And that's going to be talking about for loops, right? Python loops and data. A lot of the assignments that you have seen up to now, and I've had this conversation with somebody, I believe it was Morty, right? They addressed that some of these assignments were a little confusing or a little out of scope, and I acknowledge that. Even myself trying to figure out a way of how to do those assignments without for loops, I struggled to find a way to do that. Hopefully today, after today's lesson, if you have never encountered for loops, now you will be able to go back to those assignments and actually complete them with what you're going to learn today, right? But for loops, in short, is a way to iterate through a data structure, right? We're going to talk about the different types of for loops and how to use them. We're going to talk about while loops and then break and continue statements, right? And then how to use loops on the different data structures like strings, which you guys have already come to learn that they are essentially iterables. They are a sequence of characters, right? You'll definitely be able to loop through lists, tuples, and then even dictionaries. Nested loops are a little bit in here, but that's going to be more into tomorrow's class. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight into it, right? So loops, right? The power of computation is the ability to do a lot of actions very quickly, right? You've seen that we've had data structures with large amounts of data types. We've talked about how to access them using like indexes. But what if I want to go through a large list of data and do different things depending on what that data is? That's where loops really come into play, right? And the basic structure of a loop starts with the word for, right? This is your what it initiates it, right? For, and then it's going to follow by item, which essentially is going to be, it could be anything. It could be item, it could be I, it could be X, it could be whatever your heart desires, right? This is going to be a temporary variable, right? Very similar to when we define our functions. In our definition of the function, we set variable names like X or Y or like numbers or whatever. And then we use that as a template to know what's supposed to go in there, but the actual data that goes in there is going to be called something differently, right? Item is doing something very similar to that. It gives the individual item you're trying to grab in the list some kind of temporary variable that you can use. And we see here, we say for item in collection, right? We have a variable called collection, and I can only assume this is some form of iterable, right? It could be either a list of different data types, or it can be a string with multiple characters. It could be even be a dictionary. But what we're trying to loop through here is the collection data type itself, right? And we're saying for every item in collection, I want to do something, right? For every item in this collection, I want to do the following, which is do something, right? Loops are used to execute a code of block. Oh, I'm sorry, a code of block, a block of code repeatedly, right? That is what the do something represents in the example below. Here's the very first demonstration of a for loop, and that's using the for I in X, which is literally the exact same thing as saying for item in collection, right? For I in X, for something in X, right? For in X being an iterable, for element in iterable. Here's something that's actually a real code, right? We have here a variable called nums. This variable is a list of different integers from 1 to 5. The next line, we start a for loop and we say for X in nums, right? So for every number inside of nums, I want to do the following, which is print X multiplied by 2. We are iterating through a sequence of numbers and performing an action at every iteration. And when we run this, we see here that the first time this loop runs, it prints out 2, right? 4, 6, 8, and 10. Now, let's see that in a visual representation. What does that look like, Roger? You're showing me some code, but I can't make a mental picture of this. What the heck are you saying? Let's look at this favorite website model called TL Draw. Ignore this. This is from a previous student in a different class. But let's go ahead and create this. We're going to say nums is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit. This is that iterable that we identified, which is a list of integers. And then we started a for loop and said for X in nums, print X times 2. All right. When this starts, it's going to start a loop, right? It's going to grab the first item in nums. That's what X is going to be. And it's going to point to the very first item in this list, right? X is going to take the place of the very first item in this for loop, right? Because we're going to iterate through this variable called nums. So it starts at the very beginning of this list. X ends up taking the place of whatever 1 is. And then the first time it iterates, it's going to be equal to 1. And we then say print X times 2, which essentially is saying print 1 times 2, right? And we saw the output. We'll do that over here. Output, right? The output, it returned to us 2. Right, we see here the 2 that got printed out. Once it finished running this line, there is nothing else that follows, right? There's no other code that it had to complete. So this code block has been completed, right? It started the code, it went into it, it printed out 2 by multiplying X by 2, which X was 1. Once this code finishes, it starts back around, right? It goes back to the start of this for loop. And now X which was initially 1, is now going to equal to the next item in our list, which is 2. Right? So now, after x becomes 2, it goes back into the code block, and it says print x multiplied by 2. And this time it does 2 multiplied by 2, and the output ends up being 4. The code block finishes, and it goes back around to the start of the for loop, and x is now equal to the next item in our list, which is 3. Right? It says print x multiplied by 3, x multiplied by 2, and x is now 3. So when this finishes, this outputs 6. And it keeps doing this, guys. Right? It keeps doing this until it reaches the last item in our list. And I apologize if this is a little slow. I want to make sure that everyone understands this because this is very important. Loops are a huge concept. Once it gets to the very end, it does its final iteration. It prints out 10. And then once it's done, once it's finished looping through everything in nums, it now continues down to the rest of the code, right? It no longer goes back inside the code block and it's able to move forward. But we were able to successfully iterate through the entire list, conducting an action with every single item within this list. Does anybody have any questions on how the for x in or for I in x works? For x and something, whatever it may be. I'm sorry if I stutter a lot or misspeak. English is my second language. Any questions, guys? All right. No questions. Let's go on with the next example. Here, we're going to iterate through a sequence again, but instead of printing out, we're going to create a new variable in this for loop. We're going to assign it to a new list at every iteration, right? So just like before, we're building off on what we had earlier. We had the list of 1 through 5, but we created a new empty list, right? This list is where I'm going to add my new variables whenever I am done formatting my numbers. I once again restart that for loop for x and nums. This time, inside of this for loop, I create a variable called mult, which is short for multiply. I multiply x by 2, and after I multiply it, I'm going to go ahead and append that new variable into this list, guys. Right, so the first time this goes around, it takes 1, multiplies it by 2, and adds it into mult nums. Next time it iterates, x is now 2. I multiply x by 2, append it to my empty list, and I do that over and over again until I complete my iteration. And if I run this, I'm going to go ahead and print out both my original list and that new list I created. And we see here that the new list is everything from my original list multiplied by 2. 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So I was able to create a whole new variable of a list with the output of this for loop. Does anybody have any questions? Morty asks, what is the difference between dot append and using plus equals into a list, right? So usually, let's say, let's try doing plus equal on a list. Let's see what that does to us. Integer object is not iterable. Right? It gave me an issue here when I tried to add something on here. Plus equals works a lot better, or works in general, when you do something very similar to this, or which we'll get to a little bit. But what if I had a string called name, and this was a string of, we'll say Morty because he's the one that asked that question, and I'll say new string is equal to, and it's gonna be an empty string. I'm gonna start another loop, and I'll say for x in name, and I'm gonna say new string plus equals x. And then afterwards, I'm gonna go ahead and print name and print new string. Right? You are able to append onto a string in this shape, in a way, right? On a list, it won't work as you just saw. I was able to add characters into the string by using the plus equals. So essentially, it works almost like concatenating the string, right? You can do that with strings, or you can also do num is equal to 0, new num is equal to, let's say, iterable, no, we'll say list of nums is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we're going to iterate this list for x in list of nums. Num plus equals x. And let's print out num. You're able to add numbers, right? So plus equals will either concatenate strings, or you can add a number to an existing number. So 0 adds 1, makes it 1. We add 2, makes it 3. We add 3, makes it 6. We add 4, makes it 10. And finally, we add 5, which gives us 15. Right? So dot append will add things into a list, but the plus equals does not do the exact same thing as dot append. Carlos Alvarado. So it can go on forever. Yes and no. Right? Technically, it can. But in this code, Carlos, it's only going to go for as many items that are within nums, right? This is the condition that we set. I want to go up to nums, right? So it's going to iterate through everything within nums and stop once it's done. That is the condition that we have set here, because we passed in nums as essentially the left and right limit of where we want to start and where we want to end, right? Now you can also do something like this to answer your question. Technically, it can go forever. We'll say num is equal to 0 for, how can we do this? It won't work for a for loop, but I'll show you with a while loop. I'll answer this question at a later time throughout this class. Hopefully I can answer it then, Carlos. Right now, this is not the best case scenario. I'll answer it in a while loop. But moving on. So here we are iterating through a sequence, right? We are conducting a membership check, and then we want to perform an action depending on the Boolean result. So our iterable is our list here of URLs, right? We have Nike.com, Reddit.com, CNN, so on and so forth. These are just URL paths. We loop through their URLs by saying for URL in URLs, or we create a temporary variable called URL, and we specify that we want to loop through the iterable URLs, plural. And as we're looping through, we're checking, we're grabbing URL, the first one. The first time this starts, it's going to grab Nike.com. And we say if Apple in URL, which is Nike.com, or Dell in URL, which is Nike.com, then I want to print computer sites, and we're concatenating the URL within here, right? If this doesn't pass, we're gonna go to the next else statement where we say, if Reddit is in URL or Facebook in URL, I want to print social media site. And it's gonna fail, right? Because neither Reddit, Facebook, or Apple or Dell are within Nike.com. So because none of these pass, we go to the else statement and we print out other sites and we print out Nike.com. That finishes the first iteration, and next URL becomes Reddit. We go through this check again. We check if Apple or Dell are in our URL. It fails, so it skips this line of code. It goes to the else statement, and lo and behold, Reddit is actually within the current URL we are looping with. So it's going to print out social media site as well as our URL. And it's going to do that for every single one of these iterables. It's going to check if it passes any of these conditions, and then pending what condition it passes is going to print one thing or another. We run it here. We see that the first one, as I demonstrated, did not pass the first if or else statements. So it reached the else statement and printed out other sites as well as our URL. Reddit passed the social media site check because it consisted of the word Reddit. So it prints out this social media site string. CNN was not in either of these, so it went into the else statement, prints out other sites. Both Dell and Apple ended up passing our first if statement because both Apple and Dell are within this URL. So it printed out computer site. And then Facebook passed the second else statement, which is the Reddit or Facebook. Does anybody have any questions of how this line of block or this line of code works? Right, using if else statements within a for loop and then also conducting membership checks. Can you paste the code, please? I want to take another look at it. I'm assuming you're talking about this, so I'm gonna go ahead and paste the code in the chat. There you have it, Jamar. Now we're gonna continue on with this. The use case for a for loop, right? This loop will iterate through elements of a list or any iterable, right? That's your strings as well. It's suitable when you want to perform the same operation for each item in the iterable. In this case, it's using conditional logic to print each website URL in categories of sites. Right. We're going to stop here because time is 6:58. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back at 7:08 and continue with the rest of the class.
We can't hear you, Roger.
I hate when I do that. I start with my whole spiel. I'm like introducing myself. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Before we went on break, we were discussing for loops. We talked about for I in X, right? An element and iterated through an iterable. The next thing we're going to cover, what if we don't want to iterate through an iterable, right? Like a list. What if we had a number and we want to iterate so many times in accordance to that number, right? I want to conduct an action a number amount of times, like saying hello 5 times, right? Like my son does every time I'm with him. He's like, hello, dad, hi, dad. So what if I want to do that over and over again? Well, I can reenact the actions of my son with some code, right? So we have here an explanation of for I in 5, right? For I, once again, giving you some kind of variable, which is temporary, but it's supposed to represent the number or letter or character or the data that you're currently iterating through. And then instead of telling it of an iterable, we want to do something very similar to this, where we say like in 5. Now, would this work? Well, not exactly, right? It doesn't know exactly what to do with 5.
Roger, your screen's not shared.
Oh, thank you very much. And I start off this on the wrong foot. All right, yeah, so we have the example here where we say for I in 5. And this won't work exactly because when we just pass in something strictly like this, just one item in here, like we did before, we passed in URLs, it's going to take this and assume this is an iterable. Right? It's going to assume this is an iterable, but by default, just the integer 5 is not an iterable. It is an integer, right? You cannot just iterate through an integer. We have to let's do a little finessing to kind of get around there. So we try to do for I in 5, we're not going to be able to print out hello 5 times. We have to use a method called range, right? And range is a great method to loop through a certain amount of times depending on whatever data you're trying to pass in, right? And here is the syntax for that range method, right? So it starts very similar to the previous for loop where we did for I in some form of iterable. But instead of passing the iterable, we call the range method, and it takes 3 arguments. Now, only one of these is mandatory. The other 2 are optional, and there is a default to them. The only one that is a mandatory is going to be the stop parameter, right? So the stop is to let the for loop know how far it has to iterate. By default, the start will always start at 0, right? By default, start is 0. And the step is how many data types we want to skip over as we iterate it. And that'll make a little bit more sense when we start seeing this in code. But by default, step is also, it has a default. It's not 0, but it is 1, right? So start optional. The integer starting from which the sequence of integers is to be returned, right? It defaults to 0. Stop is the integer before which the sequence of integers is to be returned, right? So the range of integers and that stop 1, right? And we'll talk about this. And then the option was the increment between each integer in the array. And this might look a little confusing until we actually see it in code. So here we have a small explanation where I say for I in range of 20, right? Essentially, I'm going to do this iteration 20 times. And I'm going to print out I every time that we do this, right? I is going to take the place of that number that we are currently in our iteration, right? So because I mentioned to you guys the default is 0, I is going to be 0. So when we print out I, we see here that the first item it starts at is 0, right? The start defaults to 0. And it prints out 0 all the way up to, but not including, this is very important, not including the stop, right? It does not print out 20. So although I said I want to loop through for I in range of 20, it's interpreting this as I want to loop through up to 20, not up to and including 20. So if I wanted to print out from 1 and actually print out 20 as well, how can I reformat this code to give me that response? And I see here already, Jamar and I, you're a cheater because we did this together. But yes, we would do a +1. Marianne, good stuff. Right, we would say 20. Jamar, I'm just messing with you, brother. But yeah, we would say 20 plus 1, right? And that'll give us a little bit different result here. We see here they went from 0 and it actually did print out 20. But this is exactly how I want it, right? I want to also, I just want to print out 1 to start, and I want to also print out up to and including my 20. So what else do I need to add in this for loop to ensure that I'm not getting 0, but I'm starting at 1? Yeah, I would say 1, and then I would add a comma, right? Because this is very similar to the argument of a function, right? When a function has multiple arguments or parameters, right? We separate them with commas. Range, if you get to the nitty-gritty of it, is a function. It's a built-in function that's coming with Python. So we have to treat it as such, right? So we say comma or 1, comma 20 plus 1. Now, if I do this, it's going to give me exactly what I wanted. It's going to print out 1 up to and including the 20. And you are absolutely correct there, Limue. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Please correct me if I'm not. You could do 21. Absolutely. That'll work. The reason why I say +1 is because sometimes you'll get some variables that are already preset. Like if I got like, uh, x is equal to 20, then I would say like x plus 1. Or I can go ahead and just do like x plus equals 1 here, but I can all do that on one line just by passing in the +1 here. So lim is fine. Awesome. Thank you for that correction. Yeah, so we can say x plus 1. We could just change it to 21 if you wanted to. But sometimes you don't want to change the default variable, right? That's sometimes not an option. We don't want to manipulate sometimes some variables. You said try print doing print I plus 1. Yeah, so it removes the 0, right? Because if you didn't add this right here, right? But you said I plus 1, well, this will start at 0, but when you print it out, we are by default increasing the count of I when we're trying to print it out, so it won't print 0. Does that make sense, Mary? All right. Now, what if I wanted to print out every 2 numbers? I want to skip a number. Let's say I want to print out 1, right? But after 1, I want to print out 3, and then 5, and then 7, and then 9, right? Well, that's where the step comes in, right? The step is going to tell your for loop how many numbers to step over before it goes into its next iteration. So by default, we saw here that's 1. If I change this to 2, we see here that I now get 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 because they stepped over to the second number, not the first. All right, so that's how the step works. By default, because it's set to 1, it's going to print out the first one. And this is technically set to 1, right? This is reading it like this. So it's saying, hey, I want to increase by 1, right? This is very similar to if you did a for loop in JavaScript, you said for I equals 0, I less than 21, I plus plus. All right, something very similar to this if you're in JavaScript, right? That step is kind of increasing it by 1 so it knows what to go to the next iterable. All right, or you can say +2 if you wanted to skip to the next one, right? That's what the step is doing. It's doing this part of what JavaScript would do, right? It's giving it the step. Hopefully that solves any kind of confusion if you're a JavaScript user, right? But this is good, guys. Do I have any questions on for I in range or how to iterate through a specific range of a number? Okay, silence and compliance. Let's go ahead and move forward. I'm gonna go ahead and clear this output. So the use case for I in range loop is used when you need to iterate a specific number of times, right? Very specific. You're not trying to iterate through an iterable like a list or a string. You're trying to iterate through a specific range of a number, right? Often with a loop counter, I that increments by a constant value with a step, it's useful for tasks where you need to control a number of iterations and when you don't necessarily need to access elements in a collection. Now, let's actually do this too. What if I had nums is equal to, now let's not say nums. Let's say 3D is equal to hello, comma, my, comma, name is Roger. Right. We talked about iterating through an iterable. So this will be for I in greeting, print I. And we see here that we print out every single item in here. You could do this in a different way. I wouldn't use this for this specific case, but I'll show you how you can use the range to iterate through a list without iterating through the item individually. If I create a variable like length of greeting is equal to the length of greeting, what do you think it's going to return to me? It's going to return to me how long this greeting is, right? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items in this iterable. So this is going to return 5, right? This will equal to 5. I can switch this to for I in range of length of greeting, right? And we see here that it prints out 0 to 4. So let's go ahead and change this up a little bit. Let's make this to 1. We get 1 plus 4. Let's update this to plus 1 to get the 1 through 5. Now, I'm able to grab the range of 1 through 5, which I know is the length of my greeting iterable. I can also do this where I call the list greeting, and the index that I'm going to pass in is going to be whatever I is. And as we just saw here, the first time this runs, greeting is going to be, or index I is going to be 1. Well, actually, now that I look at it, we might want to change it to 0 because we want to grab the first item, which is going to be at index 0. So let's go ahead and remove this 1. And then it's going to go to the next number, which will be 2, right? Print out the rest and so on and so forth. All right, so we're able to iterate through this list as well using the range method and knowing how long this list is. All right, so there's 2 ways of looping through your list. And I show you this way because this is a little bit more familiar to how you would do it in JavaScript. In JavaScript, you don't always, you don't really have access to iterate through in a list specifically by the amount of items in the list. You have to specify the index and then select the item by index, right? So for you JavaScript fellas, this might seem a little more familiar than what I showed you earlier, but they essentially do the exact same thing. Right? Do I have any questions about using the for I in range method? All right. Here's another way of using the for loop. And this method is by using the enumerate built-in method. It's a very powerful method. I enjoyed using it a lot. But essentially what enumerate is going to do, it's going to iterate through an iterable, just like the regular for loop that I showed at the start of class. But instead of just returning the item that it's iterating through, it's also going to return to you the index, right? So we see here a prime example of how this works. The first item you have to pass in as an argument is going to be the IDX, which is going to be the index. You can call this whatever you want. We use IDX here as a short way of saying that this is index, comma, item, and enumerate, right? We are passing in the iterable within the enumerate method. And we see here in this code, within the enumerate method, we passed in the fruits list, which is the iterable. In the actual syntax of the for loop, we specify what each item in the iterable will be. The first is index. The second one is fruit. And if we run this, we can see here that index is the index of that item, and fruit takes the place of that current iterable. Right, so enumerate allows you to not only iterate through a list to grab every item, but you can also use the index. So this is a great way to be able to loop through an element and also keep track of the index that you are working on. Do I have any questions on the enumerate method for the list or for loops? Could I show you this in JavaScript? Uh, if if I'm correct, I do not believe JavaScript has this specific method at all, but the equivalent of it, Vaughn or Kong, is essentially the same thing that we did here, right? Because if you're looping through and printing out greeting by the index, you can also print out the index, right? So 0, hello, 1, my, 2, name, and so on and so forth. You said Tristan said you can use the map method. I do not want to teach the map method because that is a little out of scope here, but essentially, you probably could do the map method. I just do not want to confuse people. But this way is essentially really doing the exact same thing as enumerate because you're still using the index and you're specifically using the index to grab items in that list, right? So these are the exact same thing, just written differently. Does that answer your question, little Kong, or no? To add on to what Tristan said, so I do not want to just disregard it. He is absolutely correct. You could use the map method, but as you see here, it can get a little confusing. So I don't want you guys to worry too much about it. If you are trying to reach the same outcome, Kong, I will use the method I show you where you loop through um, in the form of the range of the length of the iterable. That way you have I as the index, and then you can access the item in that list using I as well, right? Uh, Especially if you guys are just starting off, map might feel a little overwhelming. Tristan makes a good point. JavaScript does not have a native enum, right? His source is Google, and Google never lies, right? So yeah, so if you want to reach the same outcome, Kong, it's pretty much how you would normally do it in JavaScript, right? All right. So we talked about the enumerate method. Now let's talk about looping through dictionaries because that's technically also an iterable, right? Technically, right? As you guys might have seen or remember from Monday's class, when we use a method on a dictionary like dot items or dot keys or dot values, it returned to us a list-like object, right? Because if you recall, it wasn't exactly a list. Uh, you couldn't do the same thing, but you're still able to do certain functionality like we're doing here. We couldn't append it to it or anything crazy, uh, or use index notation, but you still can't loop through it, right? Here we have our dictionary, which is key value pairs of names and phone numbers, right? Francisco, and then Francisco's phone number. Alex, his phone number, Allison, and Allison's phone number, right? To loop through items, do you guys recall what items return to us? Yeah, it returns to us the key value pairs, right? If I say print phones dot items and I run this, it returned to me a list-like object, right? And the list had tuples of the key value pairs. So because I know that items does that, I know that I need to pass in two variables to handle that, right? K for key, and we use V for values, and whatever returns back from phones dot items. And when we run this, we see here that we print out a string interpolated results of K, which is the name, phone number is, and we pass in V, which was the value. Roger, what happens if you don't pass in one of these? You're gonna get an error. What the heck? We didn't get an error, but notice. And actually, let me clear this. I think there's some weird functionality here because why are you doing that? If V is not defined. This is really weird. If I had a different file, loops examples.py. Let me double check this real quick, guys, because this should not be working. I don't know if it's a Jupyter notebook thing, but V is not defined, so this should not work. There we go. Yeah, it's a Jupyter notebook thing. I don't know why it was doing that, but when you actually try it in actual Python file, you see here that I do get an error, right? Name V is not defined. I don't know why it's still doing it here because this should return to an error. This is just Jupyter Notebooks being Jupyter Notebooks. Uh, Jupyter Notebooks is not an actual like coding type of file. As I mentioned to you guys at the start of class, this is for like research purposes and like as well I'm using it for creating curriculums and lessons to make it more readable for y'all. This is not like a perfect place to run code because yeah, as you just saw here, this is giving you a misrepresentation of what this code is doing. This should not work because V is not defined. We didn't pass in a parameter here to let it know what the heck V is. And we see that here in real time using this Python file that we get that error that name V is not defined, right? But now that if I let my for loop know how to handle that value and that's supposed to be named V, we see here that it should work as intended. Right? All right, let's try out the other ones as well. So because specifically items, as you saw earlier, returns key value pairs, that is why this for loop required two parameters to handle that. But if we're not using items for key in phones.keys, print k, it'll work, right? We don't get any error because this is only going to return keys, right? We print out phones.keys, right? It's a list of just random names, right? There is no tuples, there is no pairs here. So as this loops through, it's only grabbing one item at a time, right? Before this returning tuples. So we need to give our for loop a way to be able to access both of the items within those tuples to print them out, right? So if the list doesn't have pairs like that, you do not need that other parameter for dot keys. And then same thing for dot values. Both of those only return list of single elements. Right? And we print out values. You see here, once again, a list of single elements. So we say for V in bones dot values, print V. And we get this, right? So the reason why we use two parameters for this one right here is because of how the dot items works. It returns to us pairs of the key values. So we need to be able to handle that. So we have to pass in two arguments. Whereas keys and values, they don't do that. It's just one single list of multiple things. We use just one parameter. Does anybody have any questions about looping through dictionaries using the dot items, dot keys, or dot values? Yeah, that's a great question, Lim. Thank you for asking that. Let's go ahead. I'm gonna go ahead and clear this up a little bit. Lim asked, how can we grab a specific dict from the list? Example, how can we get Alex and Alex number only? Well, we'll keep it simple. We'll just loop through the keys. We'll say for keys, or I will say K because we don't want to use reserved names, right? So for key in phones dot keys, right? Let's print out K, right? Oh, what the? My bad. Let's comment this out. We're printing out the keys themselves, right? But I want to grab Alex's number only. So what I'm gonna say is if K is equal to Alex, print, I'm gonna call the dictionary, and then I'm gonna access the key that I'm currently working on, which is K, right? Because K is gonna equal to Alex. So technically, what this is saying is phones Alex, right? Because K at this part of the iteration is gonna equal to Alex, and this is gonna return to me the value of Alex. And we see here that I get 2, so on and so forth, right? So we would do an if statement, right? And this is what is this doing, right? It's checking if the current key that I'm working with is equal to Alex, and if so, I'm accessing that value by using the bracket notations on how to access a dictionary, which is by opening up brackets and passing in the key within those brackets, which we learned on Monday is how we get the keys of something. Does that answer your question, Lim? Yeah, no problem. Awesome. So let's go ahead and move forward. If nobody has any questions, I'm gonna go ahead and push through today's lesson. Use case, right? The for key value in thick items, right? Loop is used to iterate through the key value pairs in dictionary. And it's beneficial when you need both the keys and values, right? Both keys and values. Not every time or every problem that you work with is going to require both of them, but it's just a way of knowing how to use them. Sometimes you would just need the keys or the values, but that's how you essentially will loop through a dictionary. What do we say for X in phones? How does that work, Roger? Print X. Right, by default, as you can see here, it's defaulting to the keys. It's by default gonna grab every key in here if we do not specify something else. All right, in case you're wondering how that works. All right, here we have a nice little chart, guys, to tell you when to use them. For I and X, when you want to iterate through the elements of a collection. For I and range, when you need to loop with a specific number of iterations. For IDX and item and enumerate, when you need to access both elements and their indices, and the dot items whenever you want to use both the key value pairs. I get a question here, Morty. The keys are pretty much indexes for libraries. Not libraries, dictionaries, right? Terminology is important. But yes, you're absolutely correct. The keys is how we access the values within a dictionary, right? Whereas on lists, we have indexes, that's the address for it. Dictionaries use keys, right? That's what's mapping it to that location. That's also why it's not called a sequence, because there's no specific order. Whereas index, it's a numerical order from 0 and up, or if you're doing it backwards from -1 and lower, right? That is a sequence. Dictionaries do not have an ordered sequence. They are in unordered, right? Because they don't have a specific order they go. You can define these key value pairs in whatever order you want. They do not matter. You can still access them no matter what. All right, we talked about for loops, guys. But here's another one, which is going to be your while loop. And it's very similar to the for loop. But the difference is while loops, they're not iterating through an iterable or through a range. They're going to iterate or essentially loop through depending of a condition being met, right? A prime example of that is if something is true, then I want to do the following until it's not true, right? Uh, Here we have a pretty, I don't want to intimidate you with too much code, so let's go ahead and do a small example. And I can say x is equal to 0. And the way that we're going to start this while loop is literally by calling the while statement. So we'll say while, right? And then here's where you set the condition. While x is less than 11, I want to print x. And here's the important part. Because you're giving the while loop a condition, it's going to keep doing this iteration until that condition is no longer met, right? So I need to let it know when it's reached 11, and I have to increase that number so it meets that condition. I have to make it meet that condition at some point, right? So and I'll show you how that works in code right now. But I print out x, but then afterwards, I need to increase this number by 1. And we see here that when this loop starts, x first is initialized as 0, so it prints out 0, and then we increase it by 1. The code block is now finished, so it goes back around, and now it checks again. Is x still less than 11? Yes, it is. So it's going to print out x again, but this time x was equal to 1, so we print out 1. And we increase it. Every time it goes through its code block, it's checking that condition over and over and over again. Is x still less than 11, right? Once it gets to 10, right, it prints out 10, and we increase 10 by 1, making it 11. So when it goes back around to the while loop, it's going to check, is x less than 11? No, it is not. It is equal to 11, but it's not less than 11. So I am no longer going to run the rest of this code, and I'm going to keep moving with the rest of the program, right? And we saw that happen here effectively. Where the issue lies is when you don't reach an end on this statement that results in what's known as an infinite loop. Now, Jupyter Notebooks being Jupyter Notebooks is not going to give you the exact result that I expect, but I'll still do it anyways, and then I'll show you in the Python file. If I don't increase that x, what's going to happen to this print statement? It's going to print out 0 over and over and over and over again, because at no point did 0 ever become greater or equal to 11. So it never broke out of this loop, right? And we see here it's printing it out. It's giving me issues, but there's so much to print out, so it's truncating it. But essentially, this is just printing out 0 over and over again. And you notice here, this is it letting me know it's running and how long it's been running for. It's almost at 20 seconds and it's still going because it's yet to reach this condition, right? I'm going to force stop it here, right? We can see that here as well. X is equal to 0, while x is less than 11, print x. And it does the exact same thing, guys. Look at my scroll bar. It is so, it's crazy how much data is in here. It's running over and over. And if I bring it down to the bottom, you'll see it go back up really quickly because how much output is happening. When you're running this on VS Code here in your regular file, to stop it from running is Control C. There we go. And we essentially interrupt the code, but we stopped it. And that's the dangers of while loops. By not doing them correctly, you run into this issue. While loops are also not very effective in coding challenges for big numbers. When you guys start working more with LeetCode or Hacker Wars or HackerRank, I believe is what it's called, in Code Wars, if you ever try to use a while loop, it might work for some test cases, but LeetCode deliberately sometimes gives you some like out of this world like examples of like long integers or long iterations, right? Lists with like 1,000 inputs. There is a max to how many or how long your code can run before LeetCode will crash, or not LeetCode specifically, but your code will crash. and you'll get a runtime error. And even though your code is probably doing what it should be doing, because it's taking so long to do this, you'll get an error saying that the runtime has exceeded its capabilities. So while loops are useful, but if you try to use them in LeetCode, you're going to encounter a problem like that if your code is not efficient. So that's just one disclaimer I wanted to put out in case you're wondering when you're working with while loops in LeetCode or Code Wars or HackerRank, you might get an issue like that, right? And that's probably because it's probably not the most efficient way that you code it out, and you're getting something like this where it's just running nonstop and it's taking too long to come to an outcome. All right, so just something I wanted to point out. All right. Does anybody have any questions before I move on with while loops? Right on. So now that we showed you the very small, simple example, here is the code that was actually here for the demo. And I'll talk you through what this code is doing. First and foremost, it is importing a module called random. And module is just another fancy word for a program, right? It's a program that has a bunch of functions in there that we can utilize, right? This module has a function called randint, right? And the way that this function works is that it takes a start and an endpoint, and it's going to give you a random number between the start and end points, right? The number that we're going to start at is 1,000,000, and we want to get a random number between 1,000,000 and 20 million, I believe is what it is, right? So when this line of code runs, the random.randint function is going to choose a random number between 1,000,000 and 20 million. It's going to save it here. I don't know what it is or what it might return. It could be anything. And then with that random number established, we're going to move forward with the code. We create another variable called progress, which is equal to 0. And we'll print out what the file size, whatever number this is, comes back. We'll print it out so we know what it returns to us. And then we do a for loop or a while loop here where we say, while progress, which is 0, is less than the file size, which will be some random number from 1,000,000 to 20 million, I want to increase progress by 1. And this will keep running until progress is going to be the same as file size or greater. And what this is doing is, I'm going to check if progress is equal to, notice that they're grabbing the file size. Let's say it's 1,000,000. They're dividing it by 2. And they're rounding it down just in case it's some weird number. They're going to print out file is 50% full, right? Whenever they get the file size and multiply by 0.75, that's going to let them know that the file is at 75% full. And essentially, it's kind of doing, if you guys have ever downloaded something, and it tells you like your file is so many, the progress is like 50% complete, 75% complete. That's essentially what this file is doing. And we run this, we see here the initial code, and then it's done writing, right? So what it did, it printed out the initial number that we got from file size, which was, it looked like it's 9,923,427. It established this variable from 0, and it incremented progress until it reached this number, right? And when progress was halfway through, we printed out 50%. Once it reached the 75% mark, we printed out file 75% full. And once this was done, the while loop stopped running, right? Because it reached the condition and we printed out done writing. So these lines of codes essentially simulated the progress of a download file, right? Or something like that, right? The progress of it, right? And we can run it again. Notice that random is a different number now. It actually did not take as long because it was a lot smaller. We can run it again. And this is a much bigger number, so it's taking a little bit longer. but it's running this while loop over and over and over again until it reaches the size of whatever file size is. Does anybody have any questions on what this code is doing and how the while loop is making this happen? What would be a reason when that you would want to use a random number? That's a great question, Jamar. Uh, if you guys move forward with a job application and you guys take part of the Foundations of Programming course, I teach you guys how to make a game. And in that game, I have a lesson where we recreate the Space Invaders games. For those of you that are as old as me or older, you should be familiar with Space Invaders. It's that old retro game where you move around a spaceship. It's like I think it was called like something Galactica or something like that. I don't remember the exact name of it. Uh, and I wanted to print out a specific alien because I had like different aliens that I was printing out on my screen to show on the game. But every alien had a specific number that went to it, right? The red alien was alien number 1, right? The green alien was alien number 2, right? And so on and so forth. I had a bunch of different aliens. Uh, but it was pretty boring to just print out the same alien. So I used the random module to generate a random number between 1 and like 5. And depending what that number was the alien I was going to generate. And that allowed me to make it very dynamic and show different types of aliens throughout my entire game. So I wasn't just printing out all red aliens first and then all green aliens and so on and so forth. Another prime example that Mary just came up with here is the raffle. That's a great way of doing it too, where you can use your random one, right? Does that answer your question, Jamar?
Yes, it does.
Right on. All right. Time is 7:52, guys. We're gonna go ahead and take our last 10-minute break for the night, and then we'll finish off the rest of today's lecture. I will see you guys at 8:02. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're gonna go ahead and continue with today's lesson. So before we went on break, we talked about the while loop. The next thing we're gonna talk about is gonna be the break and continue, right? And how to handle situations that when we're looping through our iterables or elements, we don't want to do anything at a specific line of code or iterable. What to do to skip over that. All right, and break and continue are going to be our best friends for that, and they both have their uses. Here, our example.
Screen not sharing.
Oh, thank you very much. All right. Yeah, so our break and continue. Here we have our example here. There is another one which is going to be a pass, which I'll cover quickly afterwards, but it's nothing too crazy. Our example here, we have a variable called cookies, which is an integer of 9, right? These are how many cookies we have available. We have our students in here within the student variable of a list. These are actually all staff from Platoon. It's kind of funny. But here, what we're going to do is we want to iterate through these students, right? And when we get through students, we're going to give them a cookie. But what happens if we no longer have any cookies? Do we still want to continue looping through this list? Not really. And the reason I say that, right, is because right now this list has, I believe, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 people. But what if the code you have, right, this list has 1,000 or 2,000 different people in this list, right? And you've completed the task that you wanted to complete. Should you still continue looping through? No, not really. That's not very effective. You kind of want to do what you gotta do and then move on. So right now in a small concept, you don't see the big uses of it, but later on when you're working with bigger data structures, you'll see how important break statement to continue can come in handy. So we start that for loop for students, and we check if we have enough cookies. So first and foremost, do we have more than 0? And in the event that we do have more than 0 cookies, then I want to give a cookie to a student. So I print out a interpolated string where I add the name of that student within my string, and I say that he gets a cookie. Now, after I deliver a cookie, what needs to happen to the count of cookies that I have? I need to make sure that reflects that. So I do cookies minus equal 1. Right? I deduct 1 from my cookie variable to ensure that at some point I will run out of cookies. Now, if I do not have cookies, I need to do something else where I'm going to print out, sorry, so and so, right? Whatever student this is, we're out of cookies. Better luck next time. Right? So we run this and we get through Aaron, Nick, all the way up to Guillermo, right? Which is the 9th person who gets a cookie. But the 10th and 11th person, they don't get a cookie, right? We stop here the iteration at Kevin, and we say, sorry, Kevin, we are out of cookies. Better luck next time, right? The break statement is what led to this output. Once we got to the else statement, and we let the last person know in line we're out of cookies, we break the code, and this stops the loop entirely. Right? It stops the loop entirely, breaks this loop, right? And we continue on to move forward with our application if we had any more code, right? But the break statement will stop your for loop and return back to the global scope of your program to continue on with the rest of its functionality, right? Now, does everybody understand how the break statement works? Let's update this a little bit, right? This isn't too effective. How can I break out of this for loop, and instead of just telling Kevin I'm out of cookies, I want to tell everybody else that's left over, right? Let's say I not just have Kevin and Greg, but I also have Jamar, I have Morty, I don't see anybody else, Art, and Anne. Is your, or I'll say Mary. You say Mary. Mary, right? We have all these other people. It'd be kind of a shame to not let them know that we're out of cookies and just leave them hanging, right? This stops the code, it breaks out of this for loop, and we tell Kevin that we're out of cookies, but the rest of the people here, they're left not knowing what happened. What can I do instead after I break out of here to tell the rest of the students that there's no more cookies? No, we're not in continuing yet, Morty, but good guess. We could break it, but I want to keep this breaking here, right? I don't need to loop through the rest of the students, or I mean, I could do a nested loop in here, but we're not just there yet. Let's make a separate loop, right? Afterwards, we'll see how we can break out of this loop and continue with the rest of our code. And let's do a separate loop where we can grab the students that did not get cookies. All right, so let's keep this break here. But instead of saying this here, we're going to put this in a different for loop that we can go to after we break out of this one. So someone talk to me how I can do that. It'll help if you guys can come out of your mic and assist me. Nobody. Anybody. All right. I'll do it, but I highly recommend you guys volunteer, guys. It only makes you better coders. Even if you're completely wrong, it's better to give it a shot and fail miserably than to not give it a shot at all, because you'll never know if you were able to get it right. All right, so I do recommend you guys, try to participate a little bit more. It's for your own benefit, right? But we're gonna want to create a different for loop where I want to iterate through the students that did not get a cookie, right? So I might want to do something like for students in, well, I want to grab the remainder of the students that did not get a cookie. So how can this for loop return to me students that did not get cookies? Well, first and foremost, I probably want to know where I ended, right? I probably want to know where I ended in my list. And Devin, you're onto something. We want to add their names to a new list, right? We probably want to grab a separate list where only the people that did not get cookies they are at, right? So to do that, first and foremost, I probably need to know where I ended, and then after I know where I ended, I want to grab everybody else afterwards. So there's a couple ways we can do that, and we'll do one way, but there's obviously more other effective ways of doing it. But I see pop here. That is one method. What if we try the enumerate method to get the index of where we are located at? All right, so we can say IDX, comma, students, and let's add enumerate into our for loop, right? And this will allow us to get the index that we're at. And we can even see it here. We can print IDX here and then print IDX here to see what that looks like. Let's put a pause on the other for loop for now. And when I print it out, when I get to Aaron, I'm at index 0. When I get to Nick, I'm at index 1, and so on and so forth. When I get to the very end, I no longer have cookies. I'm at index 9. So I can use that to my advantage, right? I know that I stopped at index 9, and I want to grab everything from index 9 and forward, right? So what I can do is, instead of sending this message back, what if I do people with no cookies? I create a new variable. It's going to be my list. And I do some slicing, right? Where do I want to start the slice from?
Index 9.
Index 9. There we go. Now we're getting some feedback here. Good stuff. Keep it going, Johnny. Yeah, we start at index 9, right? And then we want to grab everything else afterwards. So this will return to me where I'm currently at, which is index 9, which will be Kevin, and everything to the right of it. Do I need to add anything after index 9 to specify to grab the rest of the students?
No, it'll just go to the end of the list.
Correct. It will go to the rest of the end of the list, right? It will grab everything from index 9 and onwards. And this will create a list of people that did not get cookies. And now I can use that list to my advantage. I can loop through that list instead. And I'll say for people and people with no cookies, and I can print out another interpolated string and say student, right? Sorry, there was no cookies left. Right? And you're absolutely correct, Nicholas. Thank you for pointing out. Yes, we do want to use IDX instead of 9 because we don't want to hard code 9 here because this could stop at any point. We want to use the IDX because that's what's going to equate to the 9. And that's what is going to allow us to grab that start point. And now if we run this, we tell everyone that got a cookie, Aaron gets a cookie, so on and so forth. It's going to reach the point where there's no longer any cookies, and it's going to go to the else statement. It'll create a new list of everyone that did not get a cookie, and it's going to break, which honestly, we'll break here. It'll stop the for loop, which will allow us to continue with the rest of our code. And we start a new for loop here where we iterate to the people that did not get cookies, and we tell each and every one of them there was no cookies left, right? And now you guys saw, what did we implement into this code logic? We were able to use strings. We did for loops. We did if-else statements. We did comparisons, right? We did string interpolations. We did string slicing. We used breaks. right? All these different tools that you guys have been learning allow me to be able to give different people cookies and then tell the rest of the people that there was no cookies left, right? And using all those tools, I was able to achieve this outcome. Do you have any questions on what I just did and how it worked? No questions? Let's go ahead and remove this code so it goes back to where it was. I see Jamar, yes. What's your question, brother?
I noticed, hold on, get my headset right. I noticed in one part of it says student, then it says student, then it says students. I just got a little confused. I was trying to follow for
Oh,
student and students.
for student and students. Yes. So this is the name of the interval that I'm trying to loop through, right? So that
Okay,
specifically has to be students. This is the temporary variable that I set so I know which item I'm currently iterating through so I can access that. This doesn't have to be student. This could be X for X in students,
okay,
right? This is just a temporary variable. Whatever I want to call this specific element that I'm working on, it could be called whatever. It will still work as the same, right?
gotcha.
So maybe that helps you. I just call it
Mm-hmm.
student because it was singular because I was working with one singular element. And it helped me know what I'm technically iterating through. Because using
Okay,
something as abstract as just the letter X doesn't really tell me anything. So I changed this variable to say student, so I know that the elements I'm iterating through are students, right? Make sense?
right. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, moving on, guys. So we saw the break statement and how that can break through a for loop. Now we have the continue statement, right? And it's used to skip items in a collection when a certain condition is met. Once again, we have our list of students here. And I used the example before of completed survey, right? Where we had two different lists of people who completed survey and the total amount of people in our class. We iterate through the list of students, just like we did before, and we checked. We use a membership check here, right? If student is in completed survey, then I want to continue, right? Why do I say I want to continue? Well, because I don't want to do anything to them, right? Because they've already completed a survey. The only thing I want to do is tell everybody else that has not completed the survey that they should probably complete the survey, right? So when I encounter a student that is actively inside of my completed survey list, I want to continue with my code, do nothing else, ignore them. They're good, right? They don't need any repercussions. Everybody else, I need to, get on them and tell them, hey, you need to complete a survey, right? And there's a typo here, but it's okay. Right? So the continue statement allows you to kind of skip over these people and just move on with the rest of your code. It won't break your code, right? But it'll skip over them. Make sense? Does anybody have any questions about the continue statement? Another example will be if we had a list of nums. Nums is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. But what if I only wanted to print it out numbers that are even numbers? So I can say for num and nums, if num modulus 2 is equal to 0, print, or let's say if num modulus 0 does not equal 0, then I want to continue. Else, print num is an even number, right? And that works. We check if the number is not even, and if so, I just want to continue. But if it is even, I want to print out the number and say that it is an even number, right? So that's how continue works. Two different examples. All right. Here we have another example. We have an empty list, and we're conducting a for loop in the range of 1 to 1,000 or 10,001. And we're adding that number to odd nums, right? It's going to give us a list of integers from 1 to 1,000, right? Or I'm sorry, not 1,000. I misspoke. From up to 10,000. Sorry, numbers are hard. Afterwards, I create an empty list called process nums. I start a for loop, and I check if the number that I'm currently looping through, if 9 is in that number or 0 is in that number, right? For example, when it gets to the letter 9, it's going to say if the string 9 is in num or 0 is in num, then I want to continue. Else, I want to append the number into process nums. And we can see how that works. Notice that we print out the length of odd nums, which is technically 10,000 because there's 10,000 integers in there. But the process numbers, I only get a little bit less than half. Now let's look at what they look like. Notice that the regular list, it had all the numbers that they're supposed to have, 1 through 10, were the first ones that we're grabbing. But the next list, we don't have numbers like 9. We don't have numbers like 10, right? Because both of those were not appended because they consisted of the letter 9 and 0. Everything else did not have a 9 or 0 in it. Therefore, we added them in here. But for those that did have a 9 and 0, we just skipped over them, right? So another more complex example of continue. All right, next gonna be loops with data structures, right? Loops with data structures. We talked about iterating through lists. We talked about iterating through dictionaries. We use continue and break statements. But I've also mentioned that we can loop through strings. Here's a string that says hello world, right? And we say for char in text, right? And we print out char. And it's able to print out every single character, even the comma and the space, because it takes it as an element and is able to print it out. So we're able to loop through sequences of characters, also known as strings. So that is an option. Here's another example of loops through a list. We have our list here of different strings. They seem to be brands of cars. And we're looping through the length of whatever this list is. And we're checking if the individual item at that index is equal to Chevrolet. And if it is, I want to remove it and then stop my for loop. And I do as such. It goes through, it finds Chevrolet as a very first item, it removes it, and it breaks my for loop. And now we see here that Auto Brands no longer has Chevrolet, but it has Tesla, Jeep, Rivian, Ford, and Porsche. So we're able to loop through lists. That's it's a little redundant, but you know how list works. We see it here. Next is going to be tuples, right? We can also loop through tuples here for coordinate and coordinates, print out coordinate. So loops still work on tuples. We saw dictionaries. We're looping through here for attribute in person. What happens if we don't specify keys, values, or items? What is it going to grab?
Keys.
Keys, correct, right? It's going to default to keys. So they grab the key and it's going to say, this is the key. Notice that we print out the key itself, which will be name, dot upper, and this is the value. And see how it prints out the key name and it's capitalized with the upper method. And then we get the value itself, right? We grab the dictionary, we pass it the key, which will return to us the value. We convert it into a string and it's being capitalized, right? And it adds it here into that string. We have Alice, 25, software engineer, the integer itself, and R&D, the division. So looping through dictionaries, we kind of saw this already. Just another reminder or a recap. We saw values. So I won't cover that. Nested loops. All right. It's going to touch up on it briefly, but nested loops is going to be a much more thorough conversation tomorrow, right? Nested data structures in general. But here we have a nested loop. It is a list of lists, right? This big list, nested list, has a list of integers from 1 to 3 at index 0. And at index 1, we have a list of 4, 5, 6 at index 1. We initiate a for loop to loop through the outer list, which will return to us the first time it loops through. It's going to grab 1, 2, 3. The second time it loops through, it's going to grab 4, 5, 6. Right? So when it grabs 1, 2, 3 the very first time, we start another for loop within this for loop. And it says for item in row. What is row? Well, as we already established, it's grabbing the first item within that nested list, which is a whole list itself. So we're able to iterate through that inner list and print out every single item. And we see here that it prints out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It loops through the first list itself, prints out 1, 2, 3, right? And then it goes back to the outer loop. It grabs the next item in the nested list, which is a list itself, 4, 5, 6. And then we loop through those and print out 4, 5, 6. All right. So you are able to put a nested list within each other, and you're able to loop through both of them as well. You can nest for loops within them. Do I have any questions on nesting loops? We'll get a little bit more in depth on this tomorrow on how this works, but this is just to show you that you can do a for loop within a for loop. Time complexity speaking, and by time complexity, I mean how efficient your code is running. Nested for loops are not the best option. It's okay for small data types like this, where you have like small loops. Oh, sorry, not small loops, small lists. When these lists become very complex and you start doing nested for loops, if you have 3 nested for loops, that is not very efficient. So you want to avoid multiple nested for loops. This is okay. Just know that this is an option. There will be times where you will have no choice to use nested for loops, but it's not always the most efficient way of doing things. And that's a little bit out of scope. You'll get more into that when you're talking when you get into foundations of programming, if you decide to, or when you get into the immersive program. But just know that you can do nested for loops. It is an option. It's not something you should be scared of, but it is something you can do. Right. And this is actually going to be something that you guys are going to try to use in your interview, because I know I did. Nested for loops, especially when you first start off, are a godsend. They're very good and easy to use, especially when you got to do multiple things within something. All right, data manipulation, right? So far you've learned about the basic foundational concepts of Python, right? Everything that we talked about in the course. We just introduced loops, but now how do we manipulate data within these loops? Here we have a set, and you know it's a set because there's no key value pairs, and there's a curly brackets to the left and to the right, right? It is a set of tuples, right? Tuples, not key value pairs, tuples. And they seem to be coordinates, right? Each tuple has its own coordinate. I'm assuming it's like latitude and longitude or something similar to that. We can see their floats, both negative and positive. We loop through the sets, right? So for a coord pair in my sets, and we print out the string coordinate followed by the pair of coordinates that we're currently accessing through this for loop. After we print out the coordinate, we start a for loop, right? Where we essentially iterate through that pair. So it's only going to do 2 iterations technically because there's only 2 items in the set. And what we're doing is we're rounding the coordinate, right, to the decimal point of 2. Well, round is another built-in method you guys can look into in W3 schools or anywhere in the documentation for Python. But it's a built-in method that essentially it takes in a number and it's gonna round it. And the second argument you pass in is the decimal placement, right? Or how accurate do you want to round your number to? Right, and then we print out the rounded number as well. And we see here that when we do this, we print out the coordinate and the initial loop, right? We're doing no data manipulation here. It's just raw coordinate itself, right? And then we did a for loop where we grabbed the individual coordinate, rounded it off, and then we did some string concatenation here where we combined the rounded degree string to the rounded coordinate. And we did that for both parts of the coordinate pair. Right, and then all this is doing is printing out 15 dashes. So don't worry about this part. It's just formatting it so it looks nice and pretty. But it's doing that for every pair of coordinates within this set. So you're able to manipulate data within your for loops as well. Do I have any questions on manipulating these sets and how it works?
So, okay, so we knew they were tuples because of what? Because it's no KV, so it's not key values. So,
Tuples are established using parentheses. So we know these are tuples, right? Because of that.
okay,
We know that this is a set, right? The overall whole part of it is a set because one, it's created with curly braces, but there's also something else out there that's made with curly braces, which are dictionaries, right? But the difference between sets and dictionaries is that dictionaries have key value pairs, right? Where this, it doesn't have a key value pair, it has a tuple. If this was like first coordinate colon and then the tuple itself, this makes it a dictionary now. And notice I'm getting error for everything else because Python is starting to read this as a dictionary because there is a key value pair right here. So it's saying that, hey, the rest of this is wrong because there's no key value pairs, right? So we know it is a set because of the curly braces and the very fact that this is not a key value pair, it is just one tuple. Make sense, Jamar?
yes, it does. Thank you.
Right on. All right. Data manipulation exercise. This is going to be for you guys to try it out, right? Given this list of coordinates, which may have formatting anomalies, right? What that means is there might be issues with the formatting here where something might have like a space in here or a comma, some weird character, or it might be missing some kind of some character in here. You can kind of see right here on this one right here. This has 3 spaces before it, right? Where's another anomaly that we can probably find? This one has like 5 spaces. Let's see what else. This one has like 5 spaces at the end of it. So there are some coordinates in here that are not in the proper formats as everything else. Some are not like the others, right? And we want to probably format these. Format them with a decimal point. And this listing, latitude coordinates denoted with N and S, right? North and south. These are your latitudes. Have 2 digits with 4 decimal degrees. All right, so it should probably be like 0.00.1251, right? So instead of what this shows like this, there should be a decimal point right here with 4 decimal degrees afterwards, followed by the S for the N. So those are the north and south. Those have to be formatted. And longitude has 3 digits with 4 decimal degrees, right? Those are your east and west. So here's an example. This has 3 digits, decimal, and then 4 numbers. So this should be 161 decimal 8989. Right? That's how that should be formatted. Coordinating results should look like this, and we see the example right here of how the latitude and longitude should look like. Save the new coordinates in the new list and print them out. Right? So you're going to have to essentially go through these coordinates, format them. If they are a north and south, they need to look like this. If they're east or west, they need to look like this. Right? That's going to be one of your exercises to work on. Next is going to be using the coordinate results, combine the adjacent latitudes and longitudes into tuple coordinate pairs. Right? The result should look like this, where you're taking the north or the latitude and the longitude and combining them to tuples. Adjacent, it means next to each other, right? So we see here, this is a latitude, and the one that's adjacent to it is a longitude, right? We can tell because it's a west. So these two need to be put in a tuple. These two that are adjacent to each other need to be their own tuple, and so on and so forth. That's exercise 2. Exercise 3, using the list of tuple coordinate pairs, save each one into a dictionary with keys formatted like so. Location 1, then location 2, and so on and so forth. So every time you add a new key, that second addition here, that number needs to increment. And it should be added into a dictionary. All right, that's exercise 3. And then stretch go, there are a few repeat coordinate pairs, remove them from the dictionary. So if you're able to complete exercise 1, 2, 3, then do this one where you're going to remove any repeated coordinates. So have any questions on the exercises that are on this lesson? Looks difficult, Morty. It looks, but I feel like you'll be surprised how easy they are once you guys start coding. I feel maybe looking at all this data seems a little intimidating. He said, Nicholas, the first one seems pretty tricky. There is a method. What method can you guys think of that removes spaces from the start and the end of a string? This was a method that was covered.
Strip.
Strip. Awesome. Strip will remove stuff from the start or the end of a string. There's your first clue, Nicholas. Hopefully that helps. You also have, like Morty says, we have split strings, right? You're able to split strings. You're also able to split lists, right? So there's these methods that have been taught to you guys that you have to leverage, right? These are your tools in your tool belt that you guys will utilize to reach an outcome. Leverage all these tools that have been demonstrated to you, and even some that probably have not been shown in this class. You are more than welcome to try those out, right? Everything that's been taught to you guys within this class are tools, right? Tools to reach your outcome, to problem solve. Unfortunately, there's not much problem solving that I can teach you guys. I can show you how to break problems apart and whatnot, and we will do that next week and how to resolve a problem. But problem solving is a skill, and I've discussed it with a couple students. You know, you guys have been learning how to problem solve since you guys were kids. My son, right? How did I start teaching him how to problem solve? You get those, you know, that box that has a bunch of holes, and you know, it's like stars, or, you know, a square, a triangle, and he puts the block into the hole, right? That was him beginning to problem solve, right? a lot of coding is using the problem solving skills that you have learned throughout your lifetime to reach an outcome, right? You leverage the skills that the tools that are being given to you guys to problem solve what the questions are asking for you, right? You guys have all the tools so far to answer this exercise. I can tell you guys that very confidently, right? This is one of the exercises for sure that I know that you guys can definitely solve with what's being taught. If you are struggling with this assignment, reference the previous lessons to ensure you can solve it, right? The answers are in the lessons. I promise you that. It's just using the appropriate tool for the appropriate job. That's all it is. You're not going to hammer in a nail with a screwdriver, right? Make sense? All right. There's also some additional assignments here you guys can check out as well. This FizzBuzz is actually one of my favorite ones. I use this for one of my explanations with some of the students on the one-on-one. Definitely try out FizzBuzz. This is a pretty interesting one. And as you see here on the explanation, the FizzBuzz test is an interview question designed to help filter out 99.5% of programming job candidates. And ironically, actually applied to a different job recently. Cause I like to, I venture out there, see what's out there for me. The FizzBuzz question was actually the question that was asked from me, which is kind of funny. But this is something that you will see common. So definitely try it out. See if you can solve it. It's actually fairly simple once you get down to it, but it's a very beginner question to learn and to understand. This kind of gives you an idea of how to manipulate data or and whatnot. Also, the snake casing one is also a big one. Snake case to camel case to snake case. This used to be actually one of your coding challenges in your assessments, right? Before you guys had 3 coding challenges, we had 10. This is actually like one of the first ones that were in that assessment. And it's been added here not to grade you, but to train you to ensure that you pass the other 3. So that's how the curriculum is built. Additionally, if you are one of those overachievers and you feel like this is not enough for you guys, once again, I did complete the exercise for you guys. You also have exercises to try out everything that you were taught today. Once again, try these first before you try out the other ones, because these are a little bit more simple, right? For example, here we have write a function that takes a string sentence and returns a dictionary where the keys are the words in the sentence and the values are the number of times each word appears in the string. This is a much more simple exercise in comparison to the ones on the lesson itself. So if you feel like you're not ready for the ones here in the lesson itself, definitely check out lesson 5 exercises within your exercise directory to kind of get you prepared for the other ones. Especially if you never, if you have yet to even code out a for loop yet, and this is your first time seeing it, check these out. Hopefully it helps bridge that gap. Additionally, if you need some more work, W3 Schools, guys, as you guys saw before, helps you a lot significantly. If you go to Python and you check out Python lists, go to list exercises, you have this nice, awesome new exercise module that you can try out from W3 Schools, right? Go to list. What would be the result of the following syntax? Banana, right? And submit answer. Next question. The result for this one for index 2 is also going to be banana. Submit answer, right? These are very simple. I believe they probably get harder as you go, like list comprehension, sorting a list, right? What is the correct syntax for sorting a list? Dot sort, right? So this will help you kind of practice all these additional little methods and small basic fundamentals for really understanding how to work with these data structures. So if you still think that these exercises are a little too complex for you, try these out first before moving to exercise, right? You have the tools and the resources to reach the outcome, guys, right? Take advantage of them, right? And if all else fails, Tristan, as well as myself, are here for you. Message me. I do not get enough messages about help as I should be getting. What that tells me is I am under the assumption that every single one of you guys are doing phenomenal in this course. because nobody's asking me anything. All right, I did schedule one-on-one to kind of bridge that gap for those of you guys that were maybe a little intimidated about reaching out. Hopefully that maybe helped you guys, but I am here. I am here for you guys. I am a resource of my own. So leverage me to your advantage, however you guys need. I do also have a family, so I might not always get to you right away, but I can always, maybe schedule some time. If, let's say, for example, this weekend on a Saturday evening, you're like, hey, Roger, I'm doing some coding and I'm really kind of struggling with this part of the code. Do you mind hopping in a 10 to 15-minute call to kind of explain to me what the question is asking? Absolutely. I've done it multiple times. My wife hates it, but I love it. All right, so let me know. Besides that, I got nothing else for you guys. That's going to conclude today's class. Hopefully today was very informational for y'all. For those of you guys that joined late and were not able to partake in the first part of class where we had the guest speaker, I highly recommend that you check the beginning of today's lesson so you guys can listen to Guillermo speak to you about the live technical assessment. Some good questions were asked both by the students and myself to help you understand what to expect before January 3rd, right? If you guys have no further questions for me, that concludes today's class.